There's a delay. Now, if you're listening to this, we're still waiting for it to come fully online, and that will happen in 3 minutes. So there'll be a bit of silence, a bit of chit chat, but wait on, and we'll get to it soon. You can play Pokemon Film now.
It's not loading very well in the building. You can actually apply now to put a Pokestop somewhere.
Can you?
This building should apply since you've got there's a few different organisations here. It's worth it. I think Roads Council is going to apply to at least remove one of its Pokestops.
That's hilarious. That was hilarious.
I think there's it's one thing to be upset about the amount of people in the park and the rowdiness. It's another thing to assault them with water balloons.
Yes, yeah, you're right.
The police were already there, trying to move people along and finding people. You didn't need to take it into your own hands.
No.
That's my view, but
No. But if you're into Pokemon, come up to Katoomba, the whole street basically.
yeah, I've heard Blue Mountains is the way to go. I live at Homebush Bay, so I'm right on the water and I'm getting a lot of water Pokemon, which is good because
Yeah.
it's my type of choice.
I get a lot of mouse and Pokemon.
Right.
And I know those emu type of ones.
Oh,
here,
the Doduo ones,
Yeah,
the
Doduo.
two-headed things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just here in Parramatta,
Yeah.
which is massive for it. Oh, that's right. And this is why we need someone else.
To watch both.
Yeah. Because it interferes with, my playing of the YouTube interferes with the thing. I can't leave that on.
Right.
So I have a minute. So everyone on YouTube, you've just heard that both me and Cherie are keen on Pokemon Go at the moment. If you do visit here, you get lots of the small characters. Nothing too major, but there is a Pikachu somewhere in Parramatta.
Stay away from roads at night time.
Stay away from roads. Or come to Katoomba, where you get lots of strange Pokemon, including the cat.
Cat.
Yes, the Meowie or whatever it's called.
Oh, the Meowth, yeah. Circular Quay is a great place to get water Pokemon as well.
There you go. Advice from IWSN that you'd never get
Anywhere else.
unless you Google P on the Okay, so welcome to our second online members meeting for 2016. I'd like to introduce Cherie Hayward from CFMEU and thank you for coming along today to do this. If you are just joining us, you've missed out a conversation about Pokemon, but that doesn't matter. But a few details that you may need to know about. If you want to ask a question, you will need to go to our website, www.iwsn or injuredworkersupport.org.au, www.iwsn.org.au. Move to the Your Network menu and Your Meetings after that, and then click on the Online Members Meeting page. Unfortunately, it's me by myself moderating and co-chairing this meeting, so if you do write us a question, please be patient with me as I check my mobile phone to see if it's come up. And I will be turning to the computer on several occasions just to double check. But without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Cherie Hayward again from the CFMU. And Cherie, you've come along to discuss with us Piawi.
Yes, probably the most important concept under the workers' comp legislation, and by far one of the most complicated. For those who don't know, Piawi is an acronym for pre-injury average weekly earnings, and it's sort of the cornerstone of your weekly benefits calculation. It's certainly something all of you will have, well, anybody who's on workers' comp would have got a decision telling you what your Piawi is, and so you might be aware of it as a concept, but not necessarily sure how it works. So it might be worth me going through it a little bit about what it is and why it's important and how it affects your weekly benefits in general, since it's, as I said, the cornerstone of your workers' comp claim. Piawi is a fairly new concept under the legislation change from 2012. As a concept itself, it didn't exist before then. It was basically your average weekly earnings, and that was far more straightforward under the previous legislation. At its basic level, a Piawi is calculated based on your pre-injury earnings, the average of your pre-injury earnings calculated over the 12-month period prior to your injury.
Okay, the average.
That's right.
So that's easy to calculate if you're earning, say, $1,000 a week. But if you're a shift worker, or if you're someone who works higher duties for a period of time during that week, that becomes more complicated, doesn't it?
That's right. And I mean, that's why I say at its basic level,
yep,
that's how it's calculated. For a person who's on a salary or does, a straight 38-hour week, or who doesn't do shift work, generally that's going to be easy to calculate, and you're not going to have too much controversy around that final figure. But issues such as shift work and the like do come into play for most people who would be in conflict with their insurer. The things that are calculated in it are up for debate, but the one thing that we know for sure is that you calculate your overtime and shift penalties. So if you do night shift and you get a 50% penalty rate for that, that's included in your calculations. If you get little allowances, so speaking for my industry, which is construction, we have travel allowance and we have site allowance, and that's where the conflict comes into play from our perspective and the argument that we make for our members. If an allowance is paid only for the hours that you work, it should be included in your calculation. If it's an allowance you get just as compensation, then it won't be included. Just because I say that doesn't mean the insurers agree with me. Some insurers do, some insurers don't. And to a certain extent, Wero and I have come to some sort of understanding about what may or may not be included. But going back to our basic calculation, as I said, it's the average including your overtime and your shift penalties. That is calculated over 12 months. If you've been with your employer for less than 12 months, then it's the period you've been with your employer. Okay, so even if that's a month or 2 months, that's the calculation period, what they call the relevant period. Generally speaking, that information will come from your employer. So the insurer will write to your employer, get them to fill out a form, and they've got to identify what your base rate is, but also what you earn for overtime and what you earn for shift penalties as well. Technically, you're supposed to get a copy of that form. Whether or not that occurs seems to be entirely up to the discretion of the insurer. My advice to everybody is to request a copy of that form at all times. And that way you know what your employer has said about you so you can confirm whether or not that calculation is correct.
Do the employers get any benefit from lying about the amount of wage they pay out?
Look, they don't. I don't see how they can get a benefit from that. Some employers just don't know how to calculate it. Some of them are stuck on the old calculation, being the 38-hour week or whatever your agreement is. Some want to punish their injured workers for being injured, and we can't ignore that fact that not every employer is nice. So it could be inadvertent or it could be purposeful, but I don't see how an employer can get a benefit from lying apart from taking revenge on you for getting injured.
Okay, I'll jump in there. If you are making a comment, please remember two things. One is that we are New South Wales based in Australia, so we do have somebody listening in America, and I thank you for that. Come along. I met the guys from Hawaii the other week when I was on holidaying there. So we know we've got the same problems overseas as we do in New South Wales, Australia. But at the same time, we have a comment on our webpage which will keep up for this, but we will need to remove it afterwards because it is relating basically just to America. I haven't read the whole thing, so it'll depend on what I read. Our comments policy still exists, so please, no swearing, don't name people that aren't in the public eye. Don't name yourself. You can use a pseudonym, or you can use any other beverage choice you'd like. Now, a pseudonym to put your name up, they will stay there. I've got a message from Sue McCarthy. Now, Sue says, and if you want to read this, it's down on the lower, so it's down below it. You may need to refresh your page. We've tried to make sure that doesn't happen, that it's automatically refreshed, but we don't, it's an experiment, as I said. Sue's comment is, all existing workers who have returned to work part-time instead of full-time got screwed. True?
That's true, yes.
Okay. In 2012, was working 25 hours a week and top-up payments stopped. And then when transferred back this year to work cover my wages at 2012, 25 hours a week were classed as my full-time earnings, and so paid at 80% of 25 hours a week. As I'm no longer earning, rather than looking at my pre-injury earnings, i.e. 38 hours a week, the lawyer looked at it and said I had no cause to argue.
And that's a sticking point with the legislation, and it really goes to one of the aspects of Piawi being unfair. It's not about what your earnings were when you ceased working, it's about the date of injury. So for instance, if you got injured in we'll talk about a case example. I have a member who got injured in 1999 and didn't get to the end of his weekly benefits, and he's recently gone back off because of that injury. His wages have been calculated at the 1999 rate because of the way the legislation's worded. The only increase you get is the CPI increase, so for the indexation. It is extremely unfair because people like Sue, who at that time were working part-time hours but have recently started working full-time hours, they're effectively being punished because their injury has flared up. The lawyer, I hate to say it, is correct, only based on the limited knowledge I have of your case. Unfortunately, unless the legislation changes, there's really not a lot that you can do to change that decision, and it is quite unfair.
Okay, on that point, because this is a brilliant segue, I'm going to make sure you guys can see this. Hopefully that goes there. Unions New South Wales are holding a return to work inquiry. That starts in August. I hope everyone got that. If you want to participate in the Unions New South Wales inquiry, www.unionsnewsouthwales.org.au/New South Wales for all. You'll get an opportunity to put your story in there. They're going to quite a large number of places throughout New South Wales. If you go onto that website, you will see the places that they're going to. It does start in August. If there are any people out there or groups of people out there who the inquiry is not going to, physically not going to, the more stories they get, the greater the argument is for them to get there. So we're involved in that. The Injured Worker Support Network will be coming with Union New South Wales along for the ride and doing all the investigations and the inquiry with them. And this will lead up to the parliamentary inquiry later on this year on the workers' compensation system as a whole. So we do a lot of talking about having an inquiry into the impact on the injured workers, and we've still got our change.org campaign running for that. So go onto our website, sign on to the change.org campaign. Those emails go straight to the parliamentarians that we're targeting. So they continue to this day, it's been running for about a year now, continue to this day to get an email once a week from someone saying, bring on an inquiry. So it's still live. It's not that inquiry, it's about everything, but we're going to make it our own as much as possible. So come on board, join that inquiry, because we will be involved in that one. Write a story for us as well. I'll be putting up some information more about that later.
So just to touch on the inquiry, the reason it's so important is because the rationale for the changes has been from the government to increase return to work rates. This inquiry is likely to prove, on the back of a Macquarie University report, that the legislation changes have not achieved that goal. And so it gives more weight to any push that we have as a group for legislative change. So it's really important to bring down sort of the arguments from the government, and I would we've sent it out to our members, and I'd encourage everybody who has a story to tell to get on board and tell their story. I've found that some politicians are willing to listen when there's a human factor, and so it's really important that you guys get out there and have your say.
Yeah. And remember, if you have a question which isn't POE related or wage or what we call income replacements rather than benefits or entitlements, it's income replacement. That's what it feels like, that's what it is. That's why judging a person on a 2099 or 1999 wage, excuse my language, English is not my first language, gibberish. 1999 wage is completely ridiculous and causes a lot of harm to that person, that family, and also the industry and our community at large. But if you have a question which isn't related to it, about something else, please make a comment. We will pass it on and we will try to answer it. Cherie, we didn't actually talk about your role at the CFMEU.
So my role is I'm a legal industrial officer. So workers' comp is not my only area, but I am the primary workers' comp person for our union. Given myself, I've had 3 workers' comp injuries in my life, and I've always had an interest in it. So when I was brought on board as a legal secretary, I took a real interest in helping out. CFMEU's always done a lot of work for injured workers. And then when I moved into an industrial legal officer's role, I took that with me. So workers' comp is my passion, and it does take up, I would say, more than half of my work, but it's only a small part of my role. It's only one part of my role in the union.
For good or ill, you've become the POE expert of the union movements.
It appears so.
Within that, for good or ill, you've become the POE expert for workers' compensation in general. There aren't many people out there who know POE as well as you do.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. It's an issue that really affects our membership because they get a lot of their income from allowances and from overtime. Most construction workers work 6 days a week, and in excess of their 36 hours. So it became really apparent early that we needed to get on top of what these provisions meant, because they were very different to the previous legislation, and with the impact of work capacity decisions, getting POE right is really important. So I spent a long time trolling through all the pre-injury earnings provisions to try and get an understanding of how they intersect. That eventually led to us taking on a matter which we pursued to the Supreme Court on pre-injury earnings, and that led to many conversations with the regulator, WIRO, and multiple insurers trying to come to some sort of understanding about how PRE should be calculated, because nobody seems to know how it should be calculated. Somebody needs to know, and if that's me, then so be it.
So I thank you, because my maths is crap, to be honest. It doesn't mean I can't calculate it just means I use my calculator.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people who do calculate these PREs are basically at my level of mathematics. They don't need their HSC, they don't need a degree to do the job. They've got a computer in front of them, and they calculate it from that.
Yeah.
So it's really important for people, for anybody listening now and in the future, to pay attention to those forms. And as Cherie said, get the calculations, because unless you're on a base wage like you me, who gets the same amount each day, each week, and have worked 12 months, it's going to be difficult. There are going to be questions, and it's likely that they have missed something.
And that's right. And so getting the form, which you're entitled to receive, and the guidelines are very clear about that, and it being PRE is a work capacity decision, so you're entitled to the information relied upon in making that decision. At least if you understand what your employer has said and how the insurer has calculated it, and the information they've used, you'll be able to assess whether or not it matches what you think. So everybody has an idea about what they make on average, and it may not be that you know what you've done over a 12-month period, but you'd have an idea of, say, the last 3 or so months. And so you'd be able to see whether or not that's consistent with what you have been getting. And there's 2 ways you can go about really reviewing that information. You can merely say to the insurer, I don't think that's correct, here's why, and see what they do with it. Some insurers, or I should be clear, some case managers are more likely to have a look at it without you having to go through a formal process. Although I don't know what your experience is, but we've found they've been a bit more hostile recently, so that may not work for you. There is the option of seeking a review under the Act. We've been a bit tricky about how we do it, because technically, being a work capacity decision, you have to use the work capacity review process. However, that appears to, for the time being until the 1st of August, it doesn't allow for back pay, which can be significant in some cases. I have a member who got $40,000 in back pay because his PRE was miscalculated. So there's the option of bringing a different kind of review, but I think that's going to be unnecessary with the new guidelines coming out. The new guidelines specify that you can get back pay for a work capacity review. So if your insurer is not willing to do it informally, that's the option you'll have to take. How we calculate it from our perspective, you need to identify what your base rate is. So what do you earn for a 38-hour week, or whatever the ordinary hours are according to your industrial instrument? Why that's important is because at the 12-month mark of receiving weekly benefits, you no longer get shift penalties or overtime. So it goes right back to just the base rate of pay. So identify then what a base week will be for you. I suggest using, I suppose, Excel, because it's just easy to work out, to sort of separate the different amounts, so that you can read it much more easy. So identify what your base rate is. Then look at what your overtime component is. For some that's going to be a lot, for some it's not going to be. But put a different column for overtime so you've got an idea about what you're going to lose at the 12-month mark. Then, as I said, if you've got allowances which are tied to your hours of work, we're talking about things you get paid for being at work. You must be exercising effort in order to get those allowances. And it can't be because you're doing a particular job. So things like wet work or asbestos would not be included in your pre-injury earnings because it's for a specific task. So it has to be something you always get for putting out effort. So things like fares, things like site allowance. First aid allowance is under most awards, so if you receive a first aid allowance, I'd try and include that in your pre-injury earnings. So identify what your total allowances are worth, those that will be included.
So within that, if you're talking about allowances, you mentioned an award, enterprise agreements.
Yes.
So those allowances, those things you do include, have to be included in those award or agreements. Is that an easy way of identifying
That's right.
this?
Because of the way the POE is calculated, if your ordinary earnings are calculated based on, so if your ordinary hours are calculated based on an enterprise agreement or an award, everything you do has to be in accordance with that. If you're on a different kind of contract, then you've got a whole different game. And it essentially takes out an entire section of the pre-injury earnings provisions, because they're only applicable where your base rate of pay is tied to an industrial instrument. Okay, so to be a bit more technical and legal about it, there's a section and it's 44G. And 44G says these things are excluded from a calculation of base rate of pay, but a calculation of base rate of pay is only relevant where your ordinary hours are tied to an award or another industrial instrument.
Okay, 44G is in which act? Because we have
the 87 Act,
the 87
which
Act.
is the main act. You'll find all the PRW provisions are in the 87 Act. Okay, so that's that's where a lot of the arguments come, is whether or not those allowances are excluded by 44G. So as I said, if you don't have an award or an industrial instrument, I'd say the majority of people would. It's very few people who aren't at least underpinned by an award. Then allowances are not an issue. Well, they shouldn't be an issue. The insurer will make it an issue because that's their job. So I mean that's the linchpin there. A lot of awards pay living away from home allowance, or you may get accommodation allowances. Those are more tricky, and without because I'm not very familiar with those as allowances because they're not applicable to our awards, my initial reaction is they'll probably be excluded because they're not for effort.
So, and I've got some knowledge of this.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to suggest for a moment that it's more than yours. But those fly-in, fly-out workers.
Yes.
A lot of those awards, those allowances they get for the work that they do for having to live away from home.
Yeah.
They are included in POE. You may not.
They may not be. They may be. Look, it's again, it's not something that I have a lot of understanding about, and I guess the reason why is because a lot of those fly-in, fly-out workers will max out. So while we say that your PRE is calculated on the average, there is a maximum.
Yes, and that maximum is, last time I looked at it, about $1,880.
And it's $2,042.
$2,042.
Right. So a lot of FIFO workers will max out.
Yep.
And so an argument about allowances and the like may not even come up. If you earn over the maximum is deemed to be your pre-injury earnings. And that is indexed, so every 6 months it will increase. So yeah, the allowances are an issue until you hit the maximum. They are a cause for great argument and conflict, which we're hoping, although I don't hold my breath, will be resolved with the new regulation, which is due at some point in the future. Who knows when?
So for those people who are not aware, we got a lot of changes in 2015 thanks to the union movement as well. I'm not going to own all of that, and doctors and lawyers and fellow politicians who are on our side. A lot of those are to do with health, but also a lot of the argument about changing it was to make it easier for people to understand what's happening. And Piaui is one of those areas where, as I've said before in here, and I'll say it again, barely anyone understands.
That's right.
So there are some changes coming up in August, and I believe the last change will come possibly in December. The last conversation we had with the regulator about this is in bureaucratic time, not in normal human time. And I say that not taking anything away from the regulator. It was made as a joke, and I made that joke. Is this bureaucratic time or normal time? And they said, well, it's probably bureaucratic time for you, Rowan. So don't think of that as a slight to the regulator if anyone at the regulators is listening to this. But there are a few things. Have a question here. How about if you send the insurer a request for adjustment of POA form? The insurer then has no choice but to back pay the money for the past mistakes under Section 42 of the 1987 Act.
And that's what I was referring to earlier, the tricky part about the legislation. Technically, a review under that cannot change POE. As a technical legal argument, because it's a work capacity decision, legally the legislation wants you to use the work capacity review provisions. We did start using Section 42 for the purposes of getting the back pay. So that guy that got the $40,000, we did the review under Section 42. But as I said, the legislation tells you that that must be reviewed under the work capacity review. So we've been tricky about how we do it. The changes to the regulation make that unnecessary because of the back pay component. Early on, there were arguments about the Section 42 and whether or not we could bring it and whether or not the insurer was going to allow a review. The reason for that conflict is the review under Section 42 is an adjustment of weekly benefits, not an adjustment of pre-injury earnings. And that's where they divide the two, they draw the line. Our argument has always been, well, you can't have weekly benefits without pre-injury earnings. And of course, if you're going to seek an adjustment of your weekly benefits, you're going to rely on your calculation of pre-injury earnings. But because of the way the legislation is written, that's where the conflict has arisen. By all means, bring a review under Section 42. We still do it, but knowing what I know about the upcoming guidelines, which I believe are due 6th of August, that won't be necessary, and you won't have to get into an argument about whether or not you can bring the review under that section. I know that our union does it, I know that the AMWU does it, and it's certainly something that's been discussed a lot with the unions about how we go about doing it. And it's definitely an option, but it does create its own problems in terms of arguing with the insurer.
Okay. I have a question of my own based on a conversation I had with a member quite some time ago, but I know is relevant in this day and age with casual workforce, and that is people who work more than 2 jobs. They're injured on one job. Now, one of our members, the calculation was based on that one job, which unfortunately was their part-time job of 10 hours a week, whereas they were working 30 hours a week somewhere else. Another was split, but both of them didn't actually get the extra job.
No, you don't. There's a schedule at the back of I believe it's the 87 Act, which defines different kinds of employment, so these more complicated arrangements. Where a person works 2 jobs and is injured for one, their PR will be calculated based on the highest earning job. So not a combination of the two, but the one where you earn the most amount of money. Incredibly unfair, because the reason you work 2 jobs is because one doesn't pay you enough. But it's the way it's written. The rationale has never been explained. It is just the way it is. It is one of the pushes for the pre-injury review that we were doing. that's just incredibly unfair.
I'm going to make another plug for the Workers' Compensation Review at this time. Can everyone see that? It's hard because this is also delayed. So there are problems. We've just identified one.
Mm-hmm.
So Unions New South Wales, again, go to www.unionsnewsouthwales.org.au/New South Wales for all, and stabbed in the back, I think that's a great thing to add into it, so that when we come out to your area, you can talk to us and talk to the panel about your experiences of that Section 42, and also if anyone has experienced those problems with casual employments, and it is growing, it's not shrinking.
That's right.
And we talked about that it hasn't been explained. The reason is that they don't have to pay you as much money for their calculate too.
Yeah, and
It's not
that's the
beating
way
around
it
the
is.
bush.
Look, to be honest as well, it's not the only situation where the Act punishes you for a change in your employment. The Act grew out of, well, the original Workers' Compact grew out of traditional employment being factory work, and so it is still based on a person doing traditional work, and so it doesn't really take care of those people doing those non-traditional jobs such as casual work. The other problems that you might come up across, and I know that the teachers have had a few issues with this, is if you go on secondment. So if you work in one place and you're seconded somewhere else and then you come back, you only get your PRE calculated on that short period. If you decrease your job, for instance, or you take a pay cut or whatever it is, it's that new period that's calculated, so they don't even include the higher wages period. There's all sorts of little tricky ways that you can get, I hate to say it, screwed over by the PRE provisions just because you're not a traditional worker. It's really important that you have a look at your own situation, and if you're unsure about how the law will apply to you, I certainly recommend that you seek out either your union, Injured Workers, or Bureau, at least to get some idea about where you fall in relation to the legislation.
Okay, so we're joined by a few other people. Welcome. If you want to comment or leave a message, please go to our website www.iwsn.org.au. Go to the Your Network section, and on there you'll find your meetings, and the online members meeting is there. We do update our website often in this meeting. So we have two comments there. Stab to the back has just come on to that comments section. It should be automatic. If it's not, it comes through to my mobile, which is the reason why I'm looking down all the time, and we'll get to it as soon as we can. If at the end of this, if anybody's listening to this after today, being the 15th, if you have a question, just put a comment in there as well. It'll be on a separate page. It'll be in one of our past events, not our current events. But ask the question anyway, and we will get back to you. PRE is extremely complicated in a lot of areas. The calculations for PRE, firstly, in the first 13 weeks, your PRE pre-average injury earnings.
Pre-injury average weekly earnings. Yeah. That's why we call it PRE. It's just much easier to roll off the tongue.
It is, and we know I speak gibberish before the English language, as I said before here. The pre-injury average weekly earnings. For the first 13 weeks, you get fined 5% of your wage.
That's right. I mean, the Act is split in the way benefits are worked out, and I know that you don't call it benefits, and I'm using the legal term.
Income replacements.
Yeah, I'm using the legal term, apologies. But the first 13 weeks, you're paid 95% of those pre-injury earnings. So already you're being punished. As we said, you could be punished through your PRE calculations anyway because you went over the maximum or some of your allowances aren't included. Then you get the additional punishment of the 5%. Then that decreases again after the 13th week to 80% if you're totally incapacitated.
Yes, but if you are working over 15 hours,
You still get
you
95%.
can still get 95%. But if you are working over 15 hours, you're likely to get chucked off pretty quickly as well.
And that's the other thing. I mean, you've got to always be afraid, and I don't want to use that term, but it's true that here's your work capacity process just here on the horizon, always waiting to attack. It is not, I mean, work capacity and PRWE is my area, and it's something I've done a lot of work on in the last 4 years, and I have not seen a fair work capacity decision. Fairness in terms of justice, really. Legally they may be correct, but they're certainly not fair. So while in past the week 13 it looks great and everything, you're working more than 15 hours a week, you're getting 95% instead of 80%, there's always that threat that the insurer is going to come along and make a work capacity decision. And if they don't terminate your payments, then they're going to reduce them.
Okay. Now, on that, there's a lot of talk from the insurers, the regulator and the government that people over 20% are protected. That's not true. You have to be over 30% to be protected. But even then, now when I say 20%, 30%, I'm talking about total body impairments, which is
called whole person impairment.
Whole person impairments. So your whole person impairment over 30%, you're not subjected to any of this, but you are subjected to the fines that are in place in the system.
That's right. The discounts, or the step downs as they're called, apply to everybody, regardless of who you are, what your injury is, how big your injury is. Step downs apply to everybody. As we said before, after the 12-month mark, you lose your overtime and your shift penalties, and so you're either earning 95% or 80% of your pre-injury earnings as a base rate only. So that's probably the most significant step down, and is not publicised by the regulator. They publicise the 3 entitlement periods, but they don't talk about the step down at week 52, and it's the one that catches people off guard the most, because you've been earning a certain amount of money and then suddenly it's cut in half, and the legislation allows it. In fact, it requires it. So from my experience though, most people are removed from the system before they get to the 52-week step down through the work capacity process.
Now, we'll talk about the work capacity process another day, because that is long and probably will take longer than the hour or the actual half hour or so, 20 minutes we've got left of this. The other thing I was going to discuss with you, sorry about this, Mike. Where am I? Here I am. Sorry, your comments are coming through to the mobile. So I'm double checking the mobile all the time, and unfortunately I just pressed the wrong button. But it wasn't a Pikachu. So before we started, we were talking about Pokemon Go. Stabbed in the back again. What is in place to deter the insurers from making these mistakes and making profit by ripping off the injured workers? Stabbed in the back. Sorry, I'm going to take this.
Yes.
Nothing is in place to stop the injured workers, the insurers. Now, there are officially some fines that the regulator can put in place, and my understanding is at this point the regulator is getting tough, or that's the language that they have been using with us. But we don't know what those fines are. We don't know when they're being in place. We don't know the triggers for causing the fines. We don't even know who is in charge of giving those fines or investigating those fines. There is an investigation unit in the regulator, but that covers fraud from the workers, from the insurers, and from employers. So we don't know the answer to that. So what is in place? There is nothing. WARO doesn't investigate those matters. It is not an ombudsman. If you believe that there's been a mistake, you have the right to complain to the WARO, who might be able to solve it. But now, let me explain something about WARO, please. I know I'm taking up your time.
No.
WARO only has cultural power, and it's a fairly strong cultural power, but it has fairly weak regulatory power or legislative power to make change. Its cultural power comes from the fact that it can name and shame insurers, and in fact can name and shame insurance agents as well, and employers and workers, but I don't think they've ever done that, or I'm pretty certain they won't. They have named insurers before for problems, and they probably were behind some of the efforts to get rid of the two previous ones, Gallagher Bassett and Exchanging. So they are involved, and I do have a lot of faith, but they're not ombudsmen, so they don't have the same powers. So stabbed in the back, unfortunately, there's not a lot out there that you can do to complain about it, except to complain. Now, you have the right to go to the Ombudsman, the New South Wales Ombudsman, for an insurance problem, because it is a government contract, and the New South Wales Ombudsman, which covers all of New South Wales governments, can investigate government contracts as well. I don't know how you'd go getting that down. Part of my role this year is to actually investigate doing that. Some of our members have gone to it and had their matters resolved through a phone call from the Ombudsman. So you have that power. Going to the insurers, well, I'm going to give a bit of political thing. It's basically next to useless. Still do it, because you'll be asked by others, have you done it? And sometimes there's been a result.
Yeah, I mean, there is a process for complaining. Whether or not it is heard is a different story. So your first step, and because if you're going to take it further up the chain, as Rowan said, you need to complain internally first. So you complain, unfortunately, to the case manager. If you're not happy with the outcome, then you go to the team leader. From there, your next option is to go to CIRA, the State Insurance Regulatory Authority. Unfortunately, the complaint process through there is quite slow and drawn out. There's 3 tiers, and generally just because CIRA is making noise, the insurer gives in. Not that I've seen CIRA actually themselves instruct an insurer to do something.
Yeah, and there is concern about whether CIRA can instruct or not. So with the new system, and we're getting a little bit above PRE, but the questions are, so we'll move on to this. And I'm working on the new Workers' Compensation Handbook for 2016, so this is up in my mind. With the new system, iCare is the insurer. Now, iCare has total control. And by the way, did you know iCare is a brand of a toilet paper?
Oh, no, I didn't.
It's a brand of a toilet paper.
Well, there you go.
iCare, the brand of the toilet paper. I don't know if there's copyright issues there. It's probably...
It's also a non-profit organisation as well.
Yes. iCare
not
insurer,
itself, the
no,
name.
The name, yes. iCare, the insurer, is a nominal insurer. They have full control over the insurers themselves, and also some control over the self-insurer. The regulator is separated from iCare. Now, the regulator can tell iCare what to do,
yes,
but they don't. That doesn't necessarily mean that iCare has to tell the insurers what to do.
Yeah. There is scope for CIRA to go to the insurer if they think the situation is serious enough, but because of the way bureaucracy works, their first port of call has to be iCare, because iCare contracts the insurers. So they expect that iCare will pull their insurers into line. If it's a serious issue, which we're not even sure what would classify as serious enough for CIRA to intervene, they may go straight to the insurer to try and resolve it. But yeah, I mean, Rowan's right. It's about the way it's broken up bureaucratically, which could prevent proper outcome.
Yeah, and although there is on paper changes and differentiations, none of these departments are independent. They're dependent on others. So the regulator is part of finance, safety and innovation, I think they're called now.
Finance, services and innovation.
Finance, services and innovation. WorkCover is separated. Well, Safe Work New South Wales is separated from all of those.
Yep, to better regulation.
To better regulation. And the insurer, again, is part of finance, services and innovation.
That's right, yeah.
So those departments are actually under the same departmental head.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that might give you some indication of what's going on, though they're separated on paper, and somewhat physically as well. Not necessarily separated bureaucratically, which is a different thing. And I'm not going to go into that because I know a lot about bureaucracy. So I'll bore not only you, but Cherie, who is studying law. So she's used to being bored. One of the questions, I suppose, with Piawi is, we know there's a maximum.
Yeah.
There is a minimum if your total body impairment is 30%.
I believe so.
There is
Yeah.
a minimum to that. So I think...
There's a minimum generally for Piawi.
Is there? Because I haven't seen that.
There is, yeah. It's... the last time I looked at it, and it was because... The only reason I looked at it was because an employer was refusing to provide Piawi information. It was about 115 a week, which was the minimum for Piawi. That was 2 years ago that I looked at it. But there is, I mean, I suppose it's one thing that the system expects that if you're injured, you've at least got some access to income of some variety, and that's why the minimum exists. But I would, yeah, I mean, that's my...
Does that 115 is connected to the 15 hours of work? So if you're earning...
No, that's different as well.
Okay, all right.
So, we're looking at, it's section 38, which talks about...
Of which year?
Of the 87 Act.
87 Act.
Sorry, I deal mostly in the 87 Act. Section 38 is when your benefits go beyond the second entitlement period. So usually the 2.5 year mark. In order to determine whether or not you're entitled to continue to receive those benefits, you either have to be totally incapacitated or working 15 hours a week or earning, I think I'm not sure what it's currently indexed at, but it used to be $176 a week. That's different to the minimum Piawi. And it's one of the criticisms of the scheme is that there's no continuity. So you've got the minimum Piawi is one amount, and the minimum you can earn to continue your benefits is another amount, and that kind of thing. So they're two different concepts.
Okay, and that's why she's the expert. She knows these things, she finds these things out, and where Cherie is, she actually gets to discover them as well, because of the style of work. So we're still waiting. If you have a comment, please bring it in. We've still got 10 minutes to fill, and I'm sure you guys will be bored by our conversation about Pokemon to fill it in. So there is a minimum, there is a maximum.
Yeah.
While you're on the system, it's calculated through your average earnings before you were injured. If you're new at the job, they take what you might be earning into the future into account.
It's true, yes, but there's a time frame. So depending on how new to the job you are, okay, it's not something insurers do as a matter of course. So it's something that you may need to argue about. I've had 2 people who've been there less than 2 weeks, and their Piawi was calculated on those 2 weeks, even though one was half a week. So it's not something that the insurer will do just because they have to. So it's something you need to be aware of. Off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what that time
4 weeks.
is. There you go, 4 weeks.
So it is 4 weeks.
Yeah.
If you've been in the job for less than 4 weeks, it's calculated on those 4 weeks and a projection of what it would be like into the future. So your member who was working there for half a week should have been said, well, if he's going to be there he or she is going to be there for the next 12 months, this is what they'd be expected to earn.
Yeah.
And that's one of the issues with the higher duties that is very prevalent in some of the larger organisations, but predominantly in the government service where higher duties occur. We've had a member come in who was placed on higher duties in expectation of being there for a maternity leave, so 12 months, and then an expectation that would continue because it had extra funding in the next financial year. So their calculation was based on the lower duties, not the higher duties. It should have been because it was associated with a new job, a new position.
Yeah.
the higher duties. But that was an argument. I don't know if that person won or not, but we gave them the advice of it.
I think the one thing we haven't touched on today, and is probably really important for you to understand about how POE is calculated, is, and it is probably the most controversial word under the workers' comp scheme, is what is a week. Okay.
Strap yourselves in, guys.
Yeah, everything in the Act talks about a week, and your POE is calculated based on 52 weeks. We've been saying 1 year, 12 months. It specifically says 52 weeks.
Before we get into this, injured on the job, yes, you are right. POE should be subject to indexation, but that is different from the pay raises that you'll get each year in your job.
That's correct.
So you don't get the pay raises, but you do get the indexation. So
indexation is defined under the Act as well. So it, and every 6 months, CIRA releases new documentation about what that indexation is. So, but yes, going back to a week, it's important to understand what a week means, and it has certainly been something that's been a lot of argument over the last 12 months in particular about how that's defined, because it isn't defined under the Act. So the general agreement, which has yet to be finalised, is that a week is a week. If you're injured on a Wednesday, then it goes back to the Wednesday before, the Wednesday before, the Wednesday before. We're not talking about Monday to Friday, that's not a week. We're not talking about a payroll week, that's not a week. A week is calculated based on the day you're injured, okay? So that can cause some inconsistencies with how your POE might be calculated, because your employer generally looks at a week as a payroll week or a Monday to Friday, but it's really important to understand that that's not how your POE should be calculated. As I said, if you get injured on Wednesday, work backwards, okay? And that's about as simply as I can put it, without going into all the arguments about what a week is under different provisions, etc. So hopefully the new guidelines resolve that issue, which we're led to believe they will. But for you to know that that's how CIRA considers a week should be calculated, based on your date of injury.
Okay. So, final messages.
Yep.
First one is pay attention to your POE.
Exactly.
Don't just accept that the insurer knows what they're talking about, because
they don't.
They don't. I'm saying this because I find it difficult to calculate POE, and I would love to in fact, love to. I'm not being egotistical to say I know a hell of a lot more about the workers' comp system than most people working in the insurers at the moment. So pay attention to it, and if you're not sure, find out. You can ring me up and we can try and go through it together. We can at least figure out what should be and shouldn't be, and I can answer some of your questions. If you're with a union, have a chat to the union.
Yeah. The most important thing is get the information. You can't understand what your POE is without understanding how it's been calculated. So when you get your letter that says your pre-injury earnings are blah blah blah, ring the insurer and get the form, because it won't be attached, but you're entitled to receive it.
Okay, final plug. We're not here just to talk about and reform the system. We're here to change the system. And if I can try again, this is the return to work inquiry that we and Unions New South Wales are running throughout August. If you're interested, in fact, even if you're not interested, make a point to go onto the unionsnewsouthwales.org website, www.unionsnewsouthwales.org.au/New South Wales for all, and give the story. You can make it anonymously, you don't have to give your name. Throughout August, there are 12 or 15 meetings happening around New South Wales, where you'll be given an opportunity, if you want to take it up, to come and talk to the panel. Part of that panel will be me. If I'm not on the panel, I'll be sitting right next to it, screaming and shouting when they're not listening to me or listening to you. Don't worry, they will. That was just a joke. and give your story. That will inform our submissions to the New South Wales Upper House Inquiry into the workers' compensation system as a whole. A lot of changes were made in 2014 based on the previous 2012-2013 New South Wales Upper House Inquiry. We're hoping for a lot more changes in 2016, 2017 from this inquiry. And we're fighting all along the way. So if you've come on from an area where you know there are a lot of, or you know there are a lot of injured workers there, you meet up. If you want to form up a injured worker support network group there, please let us know. If you are in an area where we have an injured worker support network, please come along, be involved. If you want to volunteer, give us a call, send us an email at support@injuredworkersupport.org.au. Let us know what you want to do and what you can do, and what your hours are and where you are, and we'll try and get you involved in that. So, Cherie, thank you very much for coming.
No problem.
I'd personally like to thank the CFMEU support over the years. They have been huge. You guys wouldn't know what happens in the background, but the CFMEU, the AMWU, and I'll make a shout out to the New South Wales Police Association as well here, who have just supplied us with a couple of computers, which we desperately need. For their support, we are supported by other people, doctors, nurses, physiotherapists and other people, but you guys are on board with us day in, day out. Cherie has come to speak on Piaui to us in our submissions and our consultations with the regulator and with politicians. You are the expert, sorry about that. You're just going to have to live with that.
Yes, unfortunately.
And live with it. If you are joining us after we've finished, this goes out on the 15th of July, and have a question or have a comment, please put it on it. It will go into our previous section. Our next one will be in a month's time. We don't know who will be coming on. I'm hoping to talk to one of our friendly lawyers to answer some questions. So come along, be involved. Injured workers, we walk together. Okay, so thank you very much for your time, and yeah, we'll talk soon. Bye.